How do you feel about blending science fiction with your fantasy, swords, and sorcery role-playing games?
Slayers from the lake! Take cover! Over here! By the town!
In my Tharizdun video, we learned that the fabled Six from Shadow are credited with defeating and imprisoning the Chain God. What I didn't mention is, according to official lore, those six heroes are rumored to have been time-traveling adventurers from the distant future. And that's just a tiny drop in an ocean of examples where science fiction has been introduced into heroic fantasy role-playing. What I'm going to do in this video is share some of the most important facts in history from this topic. And regardless of whether you're an old veteran to TTRPGs or a new recruit, I hope this video has something to offer. At the end of this video, I'll even share some DM tips that can be useful for any rule system that can help you to seamlessly blend fantasy and science fiction. With those tips, you'll confidently be able to blend genres without completely changing or derailing the tone of your campaign. And this video contains no paid advertisements, so if I'm talking about a product here, it's purely for informational purposes, many of which I actually like and enjoy. This video is by no means intended to cover absolutely every single published adventure or sourcebook on this subject. I don't know if that would even be possible in a brief YouTube video. But let's acknowledge the fact that every one of the early TTRPG designers were inspired by an existing author, from Tolkien to H.G. Wells and Asimov and everyone in between. And now we've come full circle, where authors, screenwriters, and visual artists are finding inspiration from the role-playing games they played in their youth. This has had a positive impact on the movie industry, as former gaming nerds are now the ones making the best fantasy and adventure movies. Although this video is limited in scope to discussing the D&D 5th edition, if there's a demand for more, we can broaden that in future uploads. Now, assuming you're familiar with D&D, you might also be familiar with Eberron, in which case you're probably aware of artificers. But what you might not know is Eberron is not the first D&D setting to introduce or even invent artificers. That honor goes to James M. Ward, the creator of Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha, who in 1976, from the first issue of Dragon magazine, said, "I created a race of people who had transported their island land, Atlantis, to another nearby dimension. This race, called artificers, had a high degree of technology and are very aware of magic and have devices to counter any magical effect." And Gary Gygax, co-creator of D&D, who himself authored science fiction-based material for the game. Did you know that Gary did not like or even use psionics in his own games? Psionics, Gary correctly pointed out, means electronically enhanced psychic or psychogenic ability. Gary regretted that such powers had ever been included in D&D. From an online message board in 2006, Gary admitted psionics only found their way into the game because, and I quote, "he foolishly followed the advice of fellow gamers from Chicago." And 2 decades earlier, in Dragon magazine number 103, from an article titled "The Future of the Game," Gary stated that psionics were to be removed from the upcoming 2nd edition AD&D. I'll include his full quote from Dragon magazine in this video's description. Sadly, Gary's version of 2nd edition AD&D never came to be, since he departed, or we should more accurately report, he was pushed out of TSR, the company he founded, in the fall of 1985. His ousting from the company was an ugly mess, and I will eventually cover that in a future video. While Gary wanted to see psionics taken out of D&D and placed in something modern or futuristic, I vaguely remember an article from the 80s where Gary said psionics weren't even developed for D&D in the first place. The system was slated for something like Metamorphosis Alpha. Now, don't quote me on that. I'm just looking through my sources, and I believe it's accurate. Anyway, this all seems a little surprising since Gary, along with Brian Bloom, who co-authored the 60-page Eldritch Wizardry booklet from 1976, first added psionics to the game, as well as 2 incredibly powerful technological wonders. The pages of Eldritch Wizardry first introduced us to some of D&D's most famous monsters, such as many types of demons, intellect devourers, and the psionic mind flayers, among others. It also had over 20 artifacts and relics, giving us the Hand and Eye of Vecna, the Sword of Kos, and the Wand of Orcus. That booklet also had 2 very odd, seemingly out-of-place items, the Machine of Lum the Mad and The Mighty Serpent of Luco, both of which take heavy inspiration from science fiction rather than the swords and sorcery genre. The Machina Blum the Mad was described as a gigantic piece of intricate machinery that is far too heavy and bulky to move by hand. The machine's interior is large enough to accommodate 4 occupants, with 70 levers and 30 dials. It was described as far too complicated to be repaired. So basically some type of massive robotic tank. Likewise, the Mighty Serpent of Luco was described as a relic of a visiting race of space travelers, a towering automation of metal, crystal, and some fibrous material of unknown origins. Given the proper commands, it can perform as a fighting machine, mode of transportation, or method of magical attack. It is 9 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet thick, which makes it readily apparent to any viewer and causes intelligent creatures to make a saving throw for fear. So basically, a giant killer robot. Then in July of 1980, Gygax published one of his most unique and unusual adventures. Expedition of the Barrier Peaks, ranked 5th best Dungeons & Dragons adventure of all time by Dungeon Magazine in 2004. I've covered that adventure in a previous video that you should definitely watch after this one. Here's my original copy of the adventure, which my green screen is totally messing up right now. I've DM'd this so many times, I can't even count it. I love it, and if you want some expert mind-blowing tips, check out that video. Expedition of the Barrier Peaks is rumored to have been inspired, at least in part, by D&D co-creator Dave Arneson's own City of the Gods. According to Shannon Appelcline, the editor-in-chief of RPG.net and the author of Designers and Dragons, Rob Kuntz and Gary Gygax explored Arneson's City of the Gods in 1976 when Dave DM'd a session for them in TSR's Dungeon Hobby Shop. According to Shannon, Gygax's Mordenkainen and Kuntz's Robilar wreaked havoc on the city. While stirring up so much trouble, they barely escaped with their lives. Published around April of 1985, the adventure Earthshaker, for characters levels 18 through 20 for the basic D&D rules, concerns a massive, utterly titanic steam-powered giant robot created approximately 3,000 years earlier, and it is suggested this menace was crafted by a race of evil gods similar to skill in dwarves or gnomes. In January 1987, the adventure DA2, Temple of the Frog, for characters levels 10 through 14 was published, which was updated from one of Arneson's earlier games using the chainmail rules from 1971. Because the adventure was created before D&D even existed, the Temple of the Frog is one of the oldest adventures in the entire TTRPG hobby. That adventure concerned a spaceman soldier who had crashed there in his spaceship, then used his superior technology to elevate himself to leader of the Order of the Frog, residing in Frog Swamp. Those primitive devotees believed the spaceman to be a wizard and his technology magic. Then a follow-up adventure, loosely based on Arneson's original, was published in March of 1987 as DA3, City of the Gods, for characters levels 10 through 14. That adventure is credited to Arneson and David J. Ritchie. It has the most sci-fi inspired visual cover art of any official D&D published adventure from the 80s, possibly ever. That adventure continued the story from DA2, Temple of the Frog, and answers the question, hey, whatever happened to that guy's spaceship? From the DM's background, it says that one day, a magician in a flying egg landed in a remote outpost of the realm. The magician was killed, but his egg was captured intact. Soon, the area was crawling with froggies, and froggy agents were heard to be asking questions about it throughout Blackmoor. However, as game historian Shannon Appelcline has informed us, that adventure wasn't really aligned with any of Arneson's original campaign, and Arneson later stated that his co-author didn't really consult him a lot. Shannon Appelcline says an adventure that is closer to Arneson's original can be found in the book City of the Gods, published in 2008 by Harold Stroh. I'll include links in this video's description, though it is currently out of print. Perhaps you might find a copy on eBay. And here is Tales of the Comet, a 160-page adventure module for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, originally published in July of 1997. This is, in fact, one of the first Dungeons & Dragons books released by Wizards of the Coast following their acquisition of TSR. Yay! This mini-campaign involves something falling from the sky. The PCs investigate, and they discover a crashed spaceship. The heroes are now participants in an interstellar conflict between a friendly race of aliens and evil self-replicating cybernetic drones controlled by a supercomputer, basically the Borg. More recently, we have Rime of the Frostmaiden, an official WotC adventure for 5e that includes a spaceship of sorts. And there are so many third-party books offering countless possibilities for including sci-fi elements into our fantasy games. There's just too many to name here. But I'm particularly fond of Alien Bestiary by Legendary Games. Look how big this is. This massive book has great art, fantastic presentations, and it comes in at a whopping 434 pages with nearly 300 monsters, ranging from CR 1/8 all the way to CR 30. Among these entries, you'll find mostly new creatures, but there are a few from earlier editions of D&D. And Esper Genesis. This is a great set of books for adding sci-fi elements to your D&D 5th edition games. This Esper Genesis Threats database is a bestiary with over 200 threats for your 5th edition game, ranging from AI robots, cosmic invaders, to trans-dimensional horrors. The creatures are really inventive, and the art is outstanding. Additionally, the book includes hazards one might find in the cold, unforgiving void of outer space. Though created for use with the 5th edition D&D Esper Genesis books, I've used this bestiary independently of the other books in the series, and there hasn't been any issues limiting its usefulness in any way. I've also used Ultramodern 5, which has a bit of a learning curve for my taste, and it's much more difficult to just drop it into an existing campaign. It's a worthy addition to expanding your options if you're considering 5th edition D&D rules for a modern or futuristic setting. The book contains over 70 monsters, a techno magic spell system, with additional species including mutants, aliens, and robots. I used it for a horror-themed side quest in which the PCs awoke in a 1930s New York City insane asylum. I'll cover all the details in a future video, talking about how I'm using Tharizdun as my BBEG. And right now, I'm super excited about Everyday Heroes, and I think it will do a much better job than Ultramodern for my particular needs. I'm currently working on a video specifically for the books in this line, and among my favorites that have gotten a lot of use in my games comes from Monte Games, Arcana of the Ancients 5th edition D&D. This sourcebook was created by Monte Cook, Bruce R. Cordell, and Sean K. Reynolds, all three very experienced and accomplished game designers who have an impressive catalog of past contributions to the hobby. Arcana of the Ancients finds its origins in Monte Cook's own Numenera RPG, but his team has created amazing conversions for 5th edition D&D. These Arcana of the Ancients books are among my absolute favorite D&D third-party books. The best way to sum it up is I really wanted to play a post-apocalyptic RPG like my old favorite Gamma World, or the newest and honestly best version of Gamma World, Mutant Crawl Classics. I also wanted to play Call of Cthulhu, but I just don't have enough free time to run 3 separate games, so I thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I could just put them all together? And that's what I did. So my D&D campaign turned into a mashup of time-traveling, dimension-jumping cosmic horror in an ancient Egyptian city built over a massive alien crashed spaceship. And those are just a few examples of the many, many options for flavoring your 5th edition D&D fantasy game with unusual influences from some of my favorite 5e third-party books. In fact, I'm not going to be switching to the new updated edition of D&D. My plan is to move over to Everyday Heroes. I've played D&D since 1980, but WotC has been making it really clear over the past decade or so that they no longer need or want my business. And that's cool. I found plenty of great indie companies to support. At the beginning of this video, I said I'd offer some valuable DMing tips for including sci-fi elements into your sword and sorcery fantasy games. This is really a lot of the same advice from my Expedition of the Barrier Peaks video. The advice is really very simple, and it comes down to the one simple concept that perception often equals reality. At least our subjective truths, which are colored by how we experience the world. And this is true in TTRPGs as well. The game master, you're the eyes and ears of the player characters. What they believe they are experiencing begins with your description of the environment. And of course, after you have done your part in offering descriptions, each player will interpret and process that information in their own unique way, which can lead to some hilarious misunderstandings. This means you shouldn't use modern names, and you shouldn't describe technology in a way that your players will recognize. For example, there's a bunch of videos on YouTube of middle school children being given technology from the 1980s and asked to describe what it is. often resulting in amusing and incorrect interpretations. And that's technology from only 30 years ago. Can you imagine Joan of Arc trying to identify the purpose of an iPhone? So only describe technological items in the most primitive way possible. It's not a gun. It's an oddly shaped tube with a small lever that appears to move. And the tube seems to be hollow. Do you want to look down the tube and press the lever to see what it does? And always describe things as if there's some form of magic at work. It's not a laser gun, but rather a wand that shoots beams of intense heat. Here's another trick. Modern day descriptive words and item names don't make sense to primitive people. You might as well be speaking another language. So I might describe something like, the unnatural looking humanoid is some type of construct. It seems to be trying to tell you its name. It's a 2-syllable word you've never heard before that begins with an R sound. Now, as DM, you know they've encountered a robot, but how many of you immediately picked up on that from the brief description? And that's how you present those technological objects. Now, what if you still really just don't think sci-fi has any place in a D&D game? That's fine. As we learned, even Gary Gygax wasn't entirely on board, at least in regard to psionics. So everyone will have different opinions about this. But try to think of it this way. Through the course of their adventures, characters might meet creatures from different planes of existence, different realities, and different timelines, future, past, and present. These technological sci-fi influences, especially when described appropriately, as I just described, are really just artifacts from different realities. To keep the flavor of your heroic fantasy game intact, simply go back to what I said about individual perspective creating our interpretations of reality. That's because robots are now just weird constructs and laser guns become wands. And all of these things originate from some other dimension. I hope this information has inspired your imagination. As always, I'm your host and friend Aten here at We Love TTRPGs. Please do that stuff down below. I appreciate it, the YouTube algorithm appreciates it, and I love reading your comments. I'm truly grateful for how active you've been with your thoughts and feedback. If this is your first time here, please subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and hey, we have a Discord community. There's a link down there in the comments. You can talk to us, ask questions, and we'd love to hear from you.